verse right now, we're looking at it parable by parable. And we're going back and capturing some of the parables we missed, and then we're moving forward and kind of finishing out Matthew, just looking at these stories. And it's interesting, I was talking to Jeremy this morning, and these parables are the sermons of Jesus. So it's kind of funny that we take his sermon and then we do a sermon about his sermon, and we include his sermon. But with this one, it's kind of nice that we really are just going to walk through the parable, and in many ways the parable teaches itself. But there's some key information that I think we can learn about the parable that will help. But I just want to remind you of maybe some of the parables that we've done, because kingdom parables are interesting. They are stories that are giving us a picture of what the kingdom of heaven is like. Does anybody remember the last parable that I spoke about? What did you have to hold in your hand? A mustard seed. There you go. That's how you remember things, right? If you hold a tiny seed in your hand. The mustard seed. And that was, so there's kind of two teachings of Jesus about a mustard seed. One of them is having faith the size of a mustard seed. But the kingdom parable is a different one, remember. The kingdom parable is that the kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed, something that starts small and grows way bigger than anyone thinks it could, right? So the kingdom of heaven, and just like what Jeremy was saying during offering, when we read about the churches in the New Testament, sometimes I think we have this in mind, but if we were all together, we would be like every Christian in Rome at the time, right? So it was much smaller groupings. The kingdom of heaven was maybe a small house in Rome that had 7 people. And they believed that this guy from Palestine named Jesus was the Son of God, and that his death on a cross, his resurrection, actually changed something in their life. And so in a giant city of millions, even at the time, 7, 8, groups of 7 and 8 that came together to maybe form groups of hundreds started to impact, and the kingdom began to grow. And so I think Jesus was using that parable to help them understand that the kingdom of heaven, as it starts, it's not going to start with a bang. Now, we do have Pentecost, and we can sometimes get thrown off by that number, that 3,000 were added to the day, and then they rented Arco Arena, right? That was a throwback to Arco Arena. They rented Golden One, and they started, every Sunday, and they had a worship band. That is not what happened. 3,000 were added to their number, and then many of those 3,000 went back to their town where there was not a single person who even knew what they were talking about. And they took that with them. So the kingdom of heaven is something that is small. And maybe you've seen that in your own life, in your own family. Maybe one of you, maybe it was you, got saved, and then you brought the kingdom of heaven into your family. And maybe it's still small, but it can grow. And I've seen that with my friends. One of my friends, he was the first of his family, really, to get saved. And he brought that back into his family, and his whole family has gotten saved and as a part. So think of that. That's the type of parable that Jesus is going to be using, these kingdom parables, teaching us what the kingdom of heaven is like. And then Jeff also had a lot last Sunday. One of those parables was about the shepherd who leaves the 99 to search for the one. So the kingdom of heaven is not just concerned about, oh, hey, we have 99. That's cool. We don't need to go searching for the one. The kingdom of heaven is a kingdom that is not just content with the 99. But is going to seek out the one, right? Is going to seek out the one. And then we come to this parable. So this is the parable of the unmerciful servant. And we're going to get a picture of what the kingdom of heaven is like. And I think it's actually a very practical picture that can help us even in our own lives. And so we're going to be in Matthew 18, starting in verse 21. And we're going to walk through this slowly. So maybe read a couple verses at a time. And there's actually some kind of key historical content that I think will help us feel the weight of this parable, even though by itself the parable still holds weight. But within this parable, Matthew gives us kind of a setup. He gives us the reason why Jesus is going to say this parable. So and it starts with two verses that are probably familiar. If you've grown up in the church, you've heard these. It says, "Then Peter came to Jesus and asked, 'Lord, how many times shall I forgive my brother or sister who sins against me? Up to 7 times?' And then Jesus answered, 'I tell you, not 7 times, but 77 times.'" And when you look at that, so this is the lead up, and then Jesus goes into, let me tell you about the kingdom of heaven. But what's interesting here, when Peter says up to 7 times, Peter actually thought he was like stepping up. Like he was like, hey, I might be a little more righteous than every one of these other yahoos. He's like, so he was actually shooting high. Have you ever tried to estimate high? Like, how long is this going to take? Like 2 hours? And you're hoping they say an hour, right? Like maybe with the sermon too, you're like, how long is this going to take? 40 minutes? And you want me to be like 25, right? Like, because you don't want to shoot low and then be like, no, it is much, much higher. So he's trying to shoot high. And what's interesting, it is part of traditional wisdom. Many of the teachers would advise that you could forgive a person up to a certain number. Like that was kind of accepted. What do you think that number is? What do you think? Because there's common things, there's common things in our culture that also have this same number. 3. So 3 strikes and you're out. We have that, right? And we have, fool me once, shame on me. Fool me twice, shame on you. Fool me 3 times, shame on everybody. I think I made the last part out. I think that's my own saying. But that 3 is a common number. And think about your own life. If someone is hurting you, if they've hurt you, and we have to remember too, if you've heard me speak, you've heard me say this before, when Peter is saying, shall I forgive them, he's not, I think sometimes we have a view of forgiveness that is a little bit lighter than what forgiveness is. When we say, oh, I'll forgive you, we might say, oh, it was a mistake. You didn't mean to. I forgive you. When actually there's no reason to forgive anyone because they didn't, like it was a mistake. Like maybe you can acknowledge, hey, you didn't mean to, so no worries. But we use that as like, no, I forgive you. But if you really meant it, well, what we're saying by that is if you really meant it, I would not forgive you, right? But I'll forgive you because you didn't mean to. And this is saying, no, someone who really hurts you, how many times should I forgive them? And again, in our own lives, someone hurts us once, twice. If we're getting up above 3, we're probably like, nope, sorry, buddy, you had your chance. And you probably have relationships like that. Maybe that you have been the person who's been wronged, and after 3, you were like, nope, I'm good. Or maybe you've been the person who has wronged, and you felt that after 3, maybe even after 1 or 2, cut off. And so Jesus is trying to change the cultural paradigm that I think still works for us. And so when Jesus says 77 times, or some of your translations might say 7 times, 70 times, he's being a little bit elusive, and he's actually trying to just give him a number that would just blow him out of the water. It'd be like up to 7 times, and he's not, actually 77 times. And I'm sure all the disciples just fell down on the ground. They were like, what? Obviously he's joking. This doesn't. But some scholars note that he might even be referencing in the Old Testament, sometimes vengeance was referenced as 77 times. Like someone would get revenge 77 times over. And so some scholars maybe he's connecting that dot, that within this, he's saying, because isn't that also the case? We have about 3 times that we would want to forgive someone, But if we wanted to get revenge on him, we would just add that number. We were like, I would bring you 100-fold down on what the offense you gave to me. And so Jesus is flipping that, right? Like we're quick to avenge something 77 times, but are we quick to forgive? So that's the setup. So Peter kind of has walked into it, maybe unknowingly, right? Like he thought he was, going to get the star for the day, and Jesus would be like, "Good job, Peter. 7 times is amazing." Like he thought he was going to get that, and Jesus says no, and he wants to teach him what the kingdom of heaven is like. And so we move into this parable, verse 23. So it's coming right out of that, of the 77 times. He says, "Therefore, the kingdom of heaven is like a king who wanted to settle accounts with his servants." And that was often something that they did. A lot of times the king would then have other servants who then those servants would go collect taxes from other people, and then he would just settle up with a smaller number, right? So it made it a little easier. So he's got a servant, and that servant has been collecting or should be collecting taxes from others. As he began the settlement, a man who owed him 10,000 bags of gold was brought to him. Now, when we hear that still sounds like a lot of money, right? Like if we had 10,000 bags of gold, we would probably also have a weapon on us, and we'd be like, "Do not come near," right? Again, when his disciples heard that, they had to fall on the ground, because that, like when scholars now add that up, that would have been more money than was in circulation at the time. Like that would have been more money. In kind of retrospect, like some of the records we have of Herod the Great, his annual tax revenue was 800 talents. So 10,000 bags of gold, and that's how they kind of translate that word talent. Would have been, so Jesus is giving his audience a laughable number. Like he wants to give them an impossible number. So this servant owed 10,000 bags of gold, which would have been like 100 million days' wages for a peasant at the time, right? So pretty impossible. And some scholars note that maybe translating it, 10,000 bags of gold was like the highest form of currency you could have. So bags of gold, and then 10,000 was kind of, in Greek, the highest numerical that they were going to at the time. So Jesus is trying to set the limit up here. Like, this person owes the king 10,000 bags of gold. And people would have smirked. They would have been like, "What? How is that even possible?" And we move on in 25. It says, "Since he was not able to pay," amen, "the master ordered that he and his wife and his children and all that he had be sold to repay the debt." Which, again, remember, this is the interesting part of kingdom parables. Sometimes in kingdom parables, we might read too far into them as well. This is a picture of what the kingdom of heaven is like. It doesn't always mean that the king in this story is what God is like, right? So we don't want to equate that because that's probably not what Jesus is doing here. He's just using this story overall to say this is the kingdom of heaven. Because even think about this. Would throwing the man and his wife and children, which was actually like against Jewish law, so scholars note he may have been, like Jesus might be using a Gentile king, have a Gentile king in mind. Throwing him and his wife and children in prison, is that going to get the king back any of the 10,000 gold? No, it's not. It's maybe going to make him feel a little better because he's like, well, at least that guy can suffer, right? But it's not going to actually do anything for him. That'll come back to play later because the servant will fall into that trap. But that's for me, that was a good thing this week of studying that, because sometimes when I read this parable, I can equate just the king with God. And so sometimes what the king does, you're like, oh man, what is that? And so we'll have to sift through that. There's going to be another hard verse at the end as well. Verse 26, at this time the servant fell on his knees before him. "Be patient with me," he begged, "and I will pay back everything." A completely impossible statement. he is not going to be able to pay back all of that. And that's part of Jesus' point in this story. That this person, this servant, is literally impossible for them to be able to pay back the debt. Like, even if he went to everyone who owed him money, even if he literally got all of the coins in the entire empire and brought them together, it would not be this much money. So when the servant says that, everyone even listening to that story for the first time knows there's no way he's going to be able to repay that. And in 27, we have that picture of the kingdom. The servant's master took pity on him, canceled the debt, and let him go. The king at this point would have to know it is impossible for him to pay this back. And so he takes pity on him and lets him go. And that is a really beautiful picture of the kingdom. And if the parable stopped there, this would be a great day, right? It'd be like, isn't this amazing? And the obvious correlation would be your impossible debt has been forgiven by Christ. Right? And that is true. That is a part of the gospel. That is the gospel. That is the kingdom. But it also then comes with some work on our part, or maybe a recognition on our part of the debt that has been forgiven for us. Because Jesus goes on to make a point. And remember, he's telling this whole story to answer Peter's question. We got to remember that. This is a setup. Peter's saying, how many times should I forgive? And so Jesus says, well, let me tell you about a person who was forgiven an impossible debt, and then his actions after that, right? So it's again, we're going back to answer this question. It says, verse 28, but when that servant who had just been forgiven of an impossible debt went out, he found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 silver coins. He grabbed him and began to choke him. Pay back what you owe me, he demanded. And 100 silver coins compared to 10,000 bags of gold would be like 1/millionth of what he owed the king, what the servant owed the king. So obviously, Jesus is setting this up, a small fraction of what was owed by the man. And that fellow servant fell to his knees and begged him, be patient with me and I will pay it back. The same wording from that other, right? The exact same phrase, be patient with me and I will pay it back. And this one is actually possible. Like, he probably could go get the silver coins, 100 silver coins. But he refused. The servant refused. Instead, he went off and had the man thrown into prison until he could pay the debt. And when the other servants saw what had happened, they were outraged and went and told their master and everything that had happened. Again, imprisoning this fellow servant isn't going to get your money back, right? Doesn't get your 100. Like, it would be better for him to say, okay, go to all the people who owe you money and then meet me tomorrow, and you better have 100, or I'll break your knuckles or something, right? Like, if I was doing it, I would probably start there. I would not. Sometimes things just come to me and I have to say them. I have to, like, it's part of the job. But so it doesn't, so the king throwing the guy in who owes 10,000 bags of gold doesn't do him any good. Doesn't do this servant any good to throw him in prison. He actually doesn't get money back. So the master has found out, right? Verse 32, then the master called the servant in, you wicked servant. He said, I canceled all that debt of yours because you begged me to. Shouldn't you have had mercy on your fellow servant just as I had on you? In his anger, his master handed him over to the jailers to be tortured until he should pay back all he owed. And then verse 35 is a harsh verse that kind of comes out of nowhere in some ways. It says, "This is how my heavenly Father will treat each of you unless you forgive your brother or sister from your heart." And I think the point there from Jesus is not forgive or you'll be tortured forever, right? Again, the story is he's just giving us a picture. He's giving us a picture of an impossible debt that is forgiven. And then that same person who is forgiven can't go out and forgive someone who owes him a slight amount compared to what he already owed. And I think the purpose of Jesus there in that verse is to say, hey, the kingdom of heaven is not just about receiving grace, but it's about extending grace. Like, it's about extending. The gospel is a great story if it's just for you, right? But the beauty of the gospel is that, man, now you get to extend that grace. And how that will change relationships, how that will change connections. So with this parable, again, it does, like when you read that is the way Jesus preached. Like, he would have told that story and then dropped the mic and walked away. And then the disciples would have, they had to process through that. Like, which I think is actually an amazing way. And if I was courageous enough, I would just be like, all right, go talk amongst yourselves and figure this, parable out. I'm not that courageous right now, but that was, they would have had to figure it out. And I think that is a great way to talk to your friends and say, wow, Jesus just said that. What does that mean, and what are the implications? And I'm sure they had Jesus to ask questions, and we don't always see that in print. But it's not a bad idea either for you to take that parable and to talk to your friends and be like, man, we looked at this parable in church. Wow, how does that apply? And so we'll kind of act like that. This will be us. We're all just friends. And I just want to make 3 observations of like what I think the implications of this parable are. And for us and for my own life, the first one is just this, that we love to receive grace, but we struggle to give it, right? We love when we do something wrong, we are always begging for grace, right? Well, you didn't understand, or it wasn't my fault, or this. Like we want people to give us grace. But we struggle. I mean, this is a part of human nature. We struggle within giving that grace, right? And what's amazing about, I think, this parable is that Jesus is giving this bigger picture of the kingdom of heaven, but it also shows how kind of practical the kingdom of heaven is. Like, this type of parable, I think, reaches not only into our salvation, right? It's not just about, look at the debt you've been forgiven, you are saved, extend that. It then moves from that, which is an amazing part of the story, right? And we celebrate that. It moves from that to then how we treat other people, how we treat others who have wronged us. And Jesus wants us to be reminded of the debt that has been forgiven and to extend that grace to others. And he knows that's exactly where we struggle. He knows we love to receive grace. We, like the first servant, would beg for mercy. But on the reverse of that, when someone begs for mercy from us, do we show it? Are we willing to show it? And oftentimes, you probably have stories in your own lives that you can go to right now and say, that was a moment where maybe I didn't extend grace, or someone in my family that didn't extend grace back, right? And you can see how that fractures relationships and how forgiveness would be able to heal that. But we hold on to it. And I think it's because we kind of hold on to that mindset that maybe Peter had. Well, you've just, like, maybe the first time I would have been able to show you grace. Like we struggle with that. We struggle with the first time. We can't even imagine the 77th time. I mean, like literally, I can't even imagine forgiving someone 77 times. Right? Can you picture that? Someone who's hurt you, forgiving them 77 times. I mean, maybe we could get into the high teens. I could see that. I could see us like doing our best, getting into the high teens, and then being like, we're under attack from outside. Getting into the high teens and being like, maybe, but not 77 times. And so I think it's just, this story is just a recognition of that. So that's that first observation, is just recognizing in your own life, wow, I know I like to receive grace, but I struggle to give grace. Second one is this, is that our inability to extend grace hurts others, ourselves, ultimately God. Right? That again, throwing the person in jail and torturing them for the rest of their life does not recoup 10,000 bags of gold at all. And in our own lives, failing to forgive someone, has that ever done you any good? Has that ever? Now, we've made a distinction before too here, that forgiveness doesn't mean being best friends with them and always hanging out and going to the movies together, right? Like that doesn't, it's not about being with them again, but forgiveness is something that you can do, even regardless of whether they receive the forgiveness or what happens after that. Forgiveness is something that you can do. And by withholding it, you literally are hurting yourself while you're hurting others, right? And you might, part of probably the purpose of it is you do kind of want to hurt them. That's why you're not forgiving them, right? Like you do, and so you have to recognize that. And then recognize that, wow, this is actually hurting me as well, right? Like, is it really benefited you, and I'll just throw maybe a scenario, has it really benefited you from not talking to your sister because of something she said last Thanksgiving, right? Has this year been awesome, and that was a great, I should do that more often. I should cut more people out of my life, right? Has it really benefited you? It probably hasn't. Has it benefited you to hold on to something, maybe for years? And maybe you've done a good job of stuffing it down and forgetting, and it doesn't affect your day to day, but it pops up every once in a while. And hanging on to it is literally just hurting you. And this is where I think Jesus is going in the parable. It's not actually doing anything to rectify what had happened, right? It's not actually doing anything to make anything better. And in fact, perhaps mercy here is that step to changing things. Starting with forgiveness can start to repair that relationship. And in this point, why I say it ultimately hurts God, it's not like God's like, why are you doing that? It doesn't hurt God that way, but man, when God, like, his purpose for us is that we would love him with everything that we have, and that we would love each other, right? And so when he is with us and he sees us in what we do to each other, man, I feel like that does hurt him. That does break his heart. That's the reason he's given us so many helpful guidelines, like, hey, if you don't do these things, you'll actually be better. And so his view for us is he wants us to be able to show that mercy. Now, what's amazing is that he's not a God that requires that of us and doesn't also show us mercy, right? And the whole point of this story is that, hey, God is the first who starts this party. He shows mercy, and in fact, he shows mercy to an impossible debt. And because of that, the kingdom of heaven then maybe requires us or desires that we would also extend that grace. So the worship team can come up, and that third point is that the kingdom of heaven is a kingdom of grace. And what that means is it's a kingdom of grace, as a kingdom of grace, not just that you have received it, but it's a kingdom of grace that you would then extend it to others. And here's a twist to this story that I think is also helpful. You can also forgive someone for not forgiving you, right? So there's like multiple layers to this. Maybe there is someone in your life who you have wronged and they can't forgive you. And their inability to forgive you has now caused you to not be able to forgive them for not forgiving you, right? We could just keep going, right? It's just in infinity. But that is part of it, because then that also causes the rift. So you could also, like maybe one of the servants, the second servant, I mean, I'm sure he wouldn't want to, but he could be like, okay, I'll forgive this guy for throwing me into jail and torturing me. Can you imagine that? I'll forgive him for not being able to forgive me. In our own lives, there might be people in your life who can't forgive you yet, for whatever reason. But are you at a place of maturity, a place in your relationship with God, that you can realize the grace you've been given, and you can even forgive someone for not being able to forgive you? And maybe that grace can spill over to them and soften their heart to be able to forgive you. And that is, and I'm sure the disciples at the end of this message were blown away, and the people who heard that it's not just a 3 strikes and you're out kingdom, which is kind of how they viewed God, right? Which is why they also extended that to each other. They would think, well, God doesn't give me that much grace, so I'm not going to give other people grace. But Jesus is saying, no, that's not the kingdom of heaven we're a part of. That's not the kingdom of heaven I am here to initiate. The kingdom I'm here to initiate is a kingdom that starts with grace and asks us to extend that grace to everyone that we meet. Would you pray with me? Heavenly Father, we thank you so much. We literally can't thank you enough for the grace that you have given us. And we know that it was an impossible debt that you forgave. Father, I pray that you would help us to be able to extend that forgiveness to others. Father, I pray right now for relationships that have been fractured, family relationships, friendships that have been fractured because forgiveness wasn't